If I cook and clean, can I stay? She asked the widowed rancher. He pulled up a chair. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Late autumn 1882 pressed a steady cold across the Texas flats. Dusk lowered the light to a hard gray that showed every nail head on the porch boards and every seam in the ranch house siding. A widowed rancher stood in the doorway holding a brass lamp with a trimmed wick, his shoulders filling the frame. His work shirt faded at the elbows, his suspenders dark with sweat lines that never washed out. He had the look of a man who had worked the same ground for years and counted his steps without thinking. His beard was trimmed close to save matches. His hair carried a few streaks of gray that had not been there the spring before his wife died. He had buried her under the cottonwood 3 years back and had done every job alone since then. His name was known in town, but he rarely used it here. He preferred silence and tasks that ended with a clear result. His private mission was simple and narrow. Hold the ranch together through the winter, keep the roof sound, keep the stock fed, keep the ledger honest, and avoid anything that might loosen the routine that kept his head steady. Bootfall scuffed up the 2 porch steps. A woman stopped at the top, one hand on the rail to keep her balance. She was in her late 20s. Her dress had been patched at the side seam and torn at the hem. She carried a small bundle tied in a square of cloth that did not seem to contain much more than another shirt and a comb. Sun had darkened her arms and throat. The bones in her face were sharp from not eating enough for days. Under the dirt and windburn, there was careful attention to herself. Her hair was pulled back with a piece of fabric that had been washed and wrung and set to dry whenever she had the chance. She had walked most of that day. She had tried the depot and a boarding house and a back door to kitchen and heard no. Not now, try tomorrow. She had spent too many nights outdoors that season, and her hands shook from hunger and from the strain of staying polite when the easy thing would be to fall apart. Her mission was direct. Find lawful shelter, earn it with work, avoid the hands and promises that had turned bad before, and keep her dignity intact. She looked the man in the eye just long enough to show that she knew what she was asking and said, steady enough to be understood, "If I cook and clean, can I stay?" The rancher let the words sit a full second. He looked past her to the yard. The corral post stood square because he had reset in June. The single bay gelding shifted his weight once and turned his head with a soft snort. The barn door slid true because he had planed it yesterday to beat the swell in the wood. He measured the request against the house behind him. 2 chairs, 2 plates, a bed in the spare room made up but untouched for months. The coat in the dresser that had belonged to his wife, folded with both sleeves crossed, a thing he could not bring himself to move. His first feeling was resistance. The house had become a fixed order that he could manage. His second feeling, clear and uninvited, was recognition. The woman's voice carried the sound of someone who would work before she slept. He weighed risk, need, talk in town, the short list of winter stores. He also saw her hands and the way she held her shoulders square to keep her voice from shaking. He felt the old ache that sat between his ribs move a notch and then go still. He decided. He set the lamp on a shelf, reached back, pulled a chair from the table, scraped it across the floor, turned it toward the door. "Sit and eat," he said. His voice came out rough from disuse, not unkind. He stepped aside and let her cross the threshold. She did not rush. She stood just inside and took in the room the way a person does when safety is not guaranteed. The main room was clean because he kept it clean. The plank floor was swept, though a dark stain by the stove told of old coffee. The table was scarred at one corner where a hot pan had been set once and never again. A dresser along the wall held a loose drawer that always stuck in damp. The stove had a bed of coals under ashes and a straight iron pipe that did not leak smoke. Tools, flint, striker, a small wedge of fatwood, sat in a line on a shelf, set that way every night for speed. He ladled beans from a pot kept warm on the back of the stove. He set a tin plate in front of her and a spoon. He split a heel of bread and pushed half to her side. He poured water into a cup. He did this without looking at her more than he needed to, both for her ease and his, and took the other chair only after she had lifted the spoon. She ate with control. Not greedy, not slow, just steady. The spoon clicked on the plate once when her hand trembled. She tightened her grip and kept going. The beans were plain, the bread hard at the edges, but the heat reached her stomach and brought a wave of relief that made her eyes sting. She did not cry. She focused on the next bite and the next sip. She watched the man's hands, the split knuckle, the scar at the base of his thumb, the way he kept the spoon near but not clutched. She marked his boots by the door, the hat on the peg, the neat stack of wood near the stove. Nothing careless, nothing wasteful. He kept a house that worked. When she finished, she placed the spoon on the plate with care and folded her hands. "Thank you," she said. "Small rooms at the back," he answered. He lifted the lamp and stood. She rose with her bundle and followed him down a narrow hall. The floorboards sounded off in the same order they always did. Third board soft, sixth board dry, last board a short complaint, and the familiarity of those sounds steadied him. He pushed his shoulder to the little room's door because it liked to stick when the air went wet. The room held a narrow bed, a peg rail with 3 pegs, a washstand with a chipped basin, a single window with clean glass that bent the view at the edges. A wool blanket lay folded over the foot. The lamp light put a yellow circle on the wall and showed that the corners were free of cobwebs. He said, "You can use this." She turned once, slow, the bundle still against her ribs. She checked the latch on the window. She put 2 fingers on the washstand to test how steady it was. She did not open the dresser. She did not touch the blanket. She was checking for order and for traps out of long habit. The room read as plain and honest. She felt the tight ring low in her chest loosen a small degree. "I can start in the kitchen," she said. Her voice was lower now. There was a note in it he recognized, a worker asking for the next task. "Eat first, sleep after," he said. He meant it. He also needed the pause to think through what came next. She set the bundle down on the bed. She untied the square of cloth and folded it flat as if it mattered, because it did. Folded cloth could become a bandage, a tie, a towel. That told him how she handled small things. She glanced at the tiny mirror nailed to the peg rail, met her own eyes, and looked away. Not vanity, a check for the person she still was. Back in the main room, he laid kindling as if he were showing her that he kept the fire handled and did not want help with it unless asked. He lit the coals and built a steady flame. She washed his hands, took the damp cloth from the basin, and wiped the table edges where grease hides. She wrung the cloth hard and saw the water go gray, then rinsed and wiped again until the boards looked clean in the lamp circle. She carried the dirty water out the back door and poured it where it would not freeze the threshold. She came back in and set the cloth to dry over a chair. None of it was for show. These were the basic steps of a place becoming livable. He filled 2 cups with boiled coffee made from grounds used once already. He did not apologize for the thinness. She cut it with water and drank. The bitterness steadied her. He watched her take in the pantry without touching anything. Flour barrel scraped to wood on one side, salt sack half full and tied with a tight knot, 1 onion in a bowl, a sack of beans with enough for a week if careful, 3 jars put up in summer, the ledger on the top shelf with a nail set on it as a weight. She said nothing. He read in her eyes that she had counted it all and that she felt no contempt about the state of it. He felt seen and not judged. That was new. The wind ran along the south eave and a loose strip of tin clapped once. He made a note to go up with a hammer in the morning if weather allowed. She heard the same clap and stepped to the door. She pressed the worn rug tight to the threshold with her boot. The draft eased. A small fix. He nodded. He felt something like respect rise cleanly, without the heat of pride or the drag of pity. He gathered plates to carry them to the basin. She reached at the same time. Their fingers met for half a breath. They both adjusted without flinch. Nothing charged, just proof that neither of them spooked at plain contact. They washed the tin and set it to dry. She dried the spoon and placed it handle out, ready to grab. He noticed. He fetched a second blanket from a shelf. "Nights are cold back there," he said. "I've known worse," she answered. No challenge. No reach for sympathy. Straight fact. That kind of answer cut down the distance between them faster than any talk about hopes. He respected it. She started down the hall, stopped, turned. "I won't go through your things," she said. That was a line and a promise. "There's a box in the dresser in that room," he said. "Leave it as it is." He had not meant to say that out loud. The words came from the part of him that still guarded the old life. He waited for a question. "All right," she said. No question. No tilt of the head toward the drawer. Agreement received and held. A small trust set and named. When she was in the small room, he checked the back door latch and set the front bar. He walked to the dresser and put his hand on the top without opening any drawers. He did not need to. He felt the usual pressure in his chest lessened by a finger's width. He stood in the doorway to the small room where the air still carried the trace of her hair's soap onto the day's dust. He heard her settle on the rope bed, the clean creak, the stillness. He breathed once and stepped away. At the table, he opened the ledger. Numbers from months back ran in even rows. Corn bought, nails bought, salt blocks, 2 calves sold, 1 mare traded. No figures since the first frost. He stared until the lines blurred, then shut it and put the nail back on top. He opened the front door and stood in the cold air. Frost had started on the pump handle and on the top rail. The gelding stamped once. Far off, a coyote sounded thin. He checked the animal stall doors in his head and knew each one was secured. He closed the house door and lowered the lamp. He took the lamp down the hall and stopped outside her door. He knocked once with his knuckles. "Yes," she said from inside. "There's water in the basin," he said. "Matches in the drawer." "Thank you," she said. He almost left, then added, "You can stay for now." He heard the words as if another man had spoken them and accepted that they were his. "Understood," she said. No rush of thanks. No plea to confirm it twice. The tone told him she had learned not to press a small gain until it held. He respected that too. He lay down on his own bed and watched the ceiling seam cut the dark. He kept his hands folded to keep them from reaching for work that was over for the day. He listened to the stove tick as the iron cooled, the wind touched the siding, and the weight of another person breathing quietly in the next room. The first feeling that reached him was not alarm. It was relief, a basic animal relief at not being the only person guarding a roof. He did not let that thought grow into something grand. He kept it small and true. He let himself sleep. She lay on the rope bed and stared at the window where the lamp glow thinned. She counted the sounds: stove tick, a board settling, the wind moving in a steady pattern, the man's steps returning and stopping. She sorted each sound into safe or unsafe. All safe. Her heart slowed. The food sat warm in her stomach. Her hand stopped shaking. She thought of the last town, the way a door had closed in her face, the way a foreman had looked at her and then at her chest before he said there was no work. She thought of how she had kept her voice even and walked away. She thought of the chair pulled out for her without words and felt a tightness behind her eyes. She pressed her wrist to them until it passed. She told herself the rule: work first, earn the right to stay. Keep your own counsel. Leave if hands or voices turn bad. She made a plan for morning without letting it look like a plan. Air bedding, sweep corners, count stores, mend something before breakfast to make her value clear. She slept. The house held. Nothing moved that should not move. The night passed in a plain way. When morning came, there would be 2 cups on the table, broom lines on the floor, a list to start for town, and a roof that needed nails at the south eave. The rancher's mission would remain the same: keep the place sound and honest. Only now the work would set in a wider circle. The woman's mission would remain the same: earn shelter and protect her dignity. Only now it would have a door that closed and a bed that did not ask for anything in return. That was enough for the first night. Morning came clear and pale, the kind that shows every nail head and every splinter in the porch rail, and heat from the stove bled into the hallway in a slow wave as the woman stood at the washstand and folded her blanket with square corners, because she wanted to leave no doubt about how she handled a room. She checked the dresser without opening it and saw the box still where it had been the night before and left it as promised. Then she aired the bedding, propped the window an inch, and moved into the main room with her sleeves rolled. She set water on to boil and measured out the last of the clean grounds with a careful hand. She cut lard into flour with 2 knives for biscuits and worked the dough just enough so it would rise, not more, and the sound of her knife tapping the rim of the tin cup carried down the hall to the rancher as he pulled on his boots and tested his cut palm inside a fresh wrap. The ache there a steady reminder of what needed fixing next. He stepped out and found the table already wiped and the stove drawing right. He nodded once in thanks and not to startle her, then took his hammer, a pocket full of nails, and a short roll of tar paper, and the two of them went outside where the eave on the south side lifted a fraction with each light gust because the wind had got under it. She steadied the ladder with both hands while he climbed. He set the first nail without talk, and when he called for the roll, she passed it up and held it so the paper wouldn't flap. He could feel her eyes on his boots for balance and on his hands for what came next, and he worked quick and clean and came down again with the job quieted, the tin clamped, and the paper seated. Back inside, she pulled the biscuits from the oven, split them with a dull knife, set a pan of eggs on the heat, and gave him the larger share. He tried to push one biscuit back to her plate, and she shook her head once and said, "You'll be on the roof again before noon." And he didn't argue because she was right. They ate without hurry. Then he set his cup down and said what needed saying in a level tone. "Terms. You work for room and meals. Separate rooms. I don't put hands on you, and you don't put hands on me. You can take what you need from the pantry, same as I do, and you tell me when we're short. If there's cash left after feed and salt, we'll set some aside as wages due to you, so no one can say you're here without pay. Sundays are for rest or town if it's safe. If you want to leave, you tell me in daylight and go with a full belly. If I need you gone, I'll do the same." She listened without shifting in her chair. She wanted rules plain, and she got them. She took a breath and said, "Add this. I keep my own door and key if you have spare. I'll tell you where I go on the land so you don't worry, but I don't answer to anyone else. If we go to town, I like to be called hired help, not kin, not charity. If there's trouble from anyone who knew me before, I'll tell you first thing so you're not blindsided. And I don't drink." Her voice did not rise or dip. He let that settle, then stood, went to a nail on the inside of the pantry door where a small iron key hung on a leather thong, and set on the table between them. "For your room," he said, and she took it, and it felt heavier than it looked, and the weight brought a short sting behind her eyes that she hid by standing to reach for plates. He saw and pretended not to. They cleaned the table and laid out the day's tasks. She would strip the small room, wash what needed it, mend the torn towel, sweep under the bed and behind the stove, scrub the basin and refill it, check the jars for a good seal, and start a stew later if there was a bit of meat in the bottom of the larder. He would look over the roof seam of the ridge, grease the pump packing properly now the rain had passed, check the water trough, and walk the fence line to the east where a calf had nosed a gap 2 days ago. They did not speak about fear, but both felt it in their own shapes. Her fear of being turned out by noon if she misstepped, and his fear of bringing disorder into a house that had finally held steady. The work list was how they handled both. As she scrubbed, she filled in the pieces she knew a fair-minded listener would want and that the house deserved to know. She spoke while her hands were busy, so the words would land without drama. "I came up the line from a camp outside San Marcos. The man who ran the crew said the cook needed help. When I arrived, the cook had a cousin who wanted the job instead. The foreman said I could stay if I understood how things worked, and I told him I wasn't there for that. He laughed and said I'd change my mind by the third night. I left before sundown and slept in a churchyard 2 towns over. I asked at 3 doors yesterday and got the same answer at each, which was no. Then I saw your lamp." She didn't add what it felt like to stand at a door and not be looked at as a person. She pressed the brush harder into the basin instead. He answered while he checked his tool belt and set nails in a stub of soap so they'd drive clean. "I'm not in the market for another pair of hands I have to manage like a child. I need work done right the first time. I don't have patience for talk. I don't go to the saloon because there's nothing there I want. I don't know money in town, and I don't lend it. I keep this place because it's what I swore to myself when I put her in the ground." He paused and let that stand, because he had said more than he meant to, and the air went quiet in a respectful way. He added, "Nearest neighbor is 1.5 miles west. Old couple named Ridges. They mind their own. If you're ever in trouble, and I'm not here, head there. They won't turn you away." She nodded once. "If the foreman or anyone else comes looking," she said, testing the words for weight. "I don't expect they will. He has plenty of other women to bother. But if they do, I'll be the one to speak first." There was steadiness in it, not bravado. She had learned how to end a problem before it widened. By late morning, the small room smelled of clean wood and sun, bedding pinned to the line out back and lifting in the light breeze. She knelt to scrub the baseboard behind the stove, sweat damp at her temples, and found the lost button that had rolled there some winter night years ago. She set it in a shallow dish on the dresser because a small recovered thing mattered and might fit a garment still kept. She did not open the box. She did not lift the lid. When her eyes fell on it, she kept them moving so the house would not think she was prying. He came in near noon with the ridge, seam mended, and his shirt damp with effort, his cut palm holding steady under the wrap. He washed at the basin and saw the water was fresh and the towel clean, and he felt an unplanned lightness at not having to do that himself. Then he reached to the top shelf and brought down the ledger and set it on the table. He said, "You asked for proper pay on paper. I'll mark each day with a line. We'll square it when the herd goes to market." He drew a short line next to the date and wrote, "Board, keep, labor due," and the amount they agreed on. Not much, but not nothing. He turned the book to show her, transparent and plain. She read the line and the figures and met his eyes. "If anyone asks, that book answers," she said. Then she listed the pantry. Flour low, coffee low, beans enough for a week, salt fine, lamp wick short, soap near gone. She pinned a scrap of paper to the inside of the pantry door and wrote each item on its own line. She left space between each for prices. She wrote the word nails and added 8 penny because she had seen the head size in the bucket he'd used on the ladder. He felt the quiet pride of a man who chose right about a stranger. They ate a thin stew made with the last onion, a bone from a jar, and what meat she found tucked in paper. She stretched it with dumplings. He took 2 without pretending he wasn't hungry. He told her, "I'll ride to town tomorrow or the next day." And she said, "I'd like to go, but it might be better if I wait 1 week, give talk time to forget the last woman they saw knocking doors." He considered, weighed safety against her right to be seen as a worker, and said, "We'll give it a week. Then we go together. I'll call you housekeeper at the mercantile, and you can speak for what we buy. We won't hide, but we'll be plain," and she felt something settle straight in her spine at that. Questions listeners might have asked about names hung in the air. She had one she had kept back out of habit. She wiped her hands and said, "I don't trade on names when I'm not sure I'll stay. But you can call me, and for now it's mine." She watched his face for any sign he would turn it into a handle. He did not. He gave his name in return, not loud, not soft, and the exchange landed like a fair handshake, not a claim. Later there would be more to learn. For now, it was enough to be able to call out to each other if a horse spooked or a pot boiled over. In the afternoon, he walked the east fence and found the post the calf had loosened and drove the staple in true with 3 strikes. He checked the wire tension and listened for the small twang that meant the line would hold. He counted cattle without writing it down because he knew each by its markings: a red heifer with a nicked ear, a mottled steer with a lazy eye. He marked in his head which needed salt and which would winter well, the work steadying his thoughts the way it always did. And he realized more than once that he was thinking forward into winter with, and already included in the picture, 2 plates, 2 cups, 2 sets of boots by the door. While he was out, she mended the side seam of her dress with small, even stitches, then took his cracked work shirt from where she had left it folded and reinforced the elbow with a careful patch cut from the hem of a flour sack. She stitched the edges down so they wouldn't catch. She set the shirt on the back of his chair with the needle still threaded and a note under it that read, "Finish after supper," not as a demand, but because she didn't want to put a needle away half done without his say. Small courtesies that keep a place smooth. Before sundown, she carried a small bundle wrapped in a cloth out to the cottonwood and set it at the base of the marker without ceremony. Inside were the recovered button, a short sprig of dried sage she had kept at the bottom of her bundle, and 2 biscuits saved back. She stood a moment with her hands folded, not in prayer, but in respect. She said nothing. When the rancher came from the barn, he saw the bundle and the way she had set it, and he didn't ask why. He said, "Thank you for not going through the box," and she said, "Some things don't need witnesses," and that was the end of it. Evening drew in, and the house changed with it. He brought in a stack of wood and set it by the stove. She pulled the stew pot to the front and added a handful of beans for tomorrow so they could soak in the warm. They ate at the table with their sleeves rolled. They compared lists for town. They agreed to leave before noon the following Saturday and to stop at the parson first so he could write an entry that she worked as a housekeeper on wages. She asked for that because paper and a ledger at a church shut down talk faster than any argument, and he agreed because he saw the sense of it and because it cost nothing but 5 minutes. Before they turned in, she took the key from her pocket, tested the lock on her door, opened it again so the house wouldn't feel shut against him, and set the key on a washstand where she could find it in the dark. He checked the window latches, the front bar, the back latch, and looked in on the small room without crossing the threshold. The lamp on her washstand threw a steady light, and the room held the plain comfort of things in their place. He felt the day's strain ease in his shoulders, not because the work was done. It never was, but because it was shared now by degrees that counted. He lay down and listened as he had the night before. The stove ticking, the quiet creak of rope, the soft thud of a shoe set under a bed. And he thought through his decision one more time for weakness and found none that mattered. She lay down and went over her plan for morning without letting it turn to worry. She would rise early, put beans on, sweep the yard side of the porch, rake out the ashes from the stove box, and set fresh coals, cut a patch for the torn towel, and mend the loose hem on her dress so she could stand in town next week without looking like a stray. If anyone asked who she was, she would say, steady and exact, I work for wages at the ranch east of the flats. And if the foreman from San Marcos ever showed his face, which she doubted, she would walk out onto the porch in daylight with the rancher at her shoulder and speak first. Nothing fancy closed the day, only the facts of a house occupied by two people who had set their terms, answered the questions that mattered. Who are you? Why are you here? What do you want? What will you not allow? And left the rest for time to show. The wind stayed off the roof. The pump held water without a leak. The ledger carried a new line with a fair figure, and the key on the washstand weighed exactly what it should, no more and no less. They slept with tomorrow already shaped enough to meet it without fear. The next morning started before full light, and the stove sent a steady ribbon of heat into the hall while coffee boiled thin in the woman, and set 2 cups near the back of the range so they would not scald. She had the key in her pocket and touched it once to be sure it was there, because the weight of it had worked on her sleep in a good way. She aired the bedding again and folded the blanket with square corners and checked that the washstand pitcher was full and the basin clean. She put beans to soak for the evening so the house would smell like a place where meals were planned and not just found. The rancher came out of his room with his boots hooked by 2 fingers and a fresh wrap on his palm, and he nodded at the coffee and at the broom line still sharp on the floor, and sat to pull on his boots without words because there wasn't anything to correct or fix in that moment. They ate the last 2 biscuits with coffee and split an apple she had scrubbed and cut clean of soft spots. Then he said what had pressed on his mind in the night. We didn't trade names proper yesterday. He looked at her to check if she wanted that, and she did, because staying nameless set a person adrift. Grant Hollis, he said, plain and steady. Born north of here, near Lampasas, drove cattle in my 20s, came back, married, buried my wife 3 years ago. I'm here to keep this place sound through winter and to leave it better in spring than it was in fall. That's the whole of it. And I'm in Carver, she said, and she held his eyes the same way she had on the porch. Learned kitchen work at a mission school and then in 2 ranch houses. Can read and write and keep figures. Left the second place when the boss's cousin thought pay mint price. I'm here to work for lawful wages, to keep my body my own, and to stand on my feet with a roof over me. That's the whole of it. They both felt the line of that trade settle correct and necessary. He lifted his chin toward the small room down the hall and said the part that a careful listener might have wanted clear, and had not asked out of respect. The box holds her shawl, and a few letters, and a ring she couldn't wear when her hands swelled from the fever. I don't open it. It stays as it is. And said only, understood, and the air held steady because the rule was simple and kept. They set the day's list, as they had started to do, without needing to talk it to death. She would wash the floor by halves so the boards could dry, without warping, mend the tear in the towel, scrape the stove box, and lay fresh coals. She would go through the jars, test the seals, and write down any that had failed. He would cut thin shims and quiet the loose tread on the porch, grease the pump packing now the cold was in the ground, and take the wagon to the back pasture to check the low section of fence. Then he added, Saturday we go to town together. We'll stop with the parson first and have him write that you work here for wages, your full name in his ledger. Then we'll buy what's on the list, and we'll get you boots that fit. She nodded once and felt relief climb up behind her ribs because the plan met every need she had named, and it put her where talk could be answered with paper. By mid-morning, the pump handle moved smooth again, and the trough filled without a leak, and had the small room scrubbed from corners out and the floor drying in a pale line of sunlight. She stood in her doorway and looked at the yard and at the barn and at the cottonwood, and she thought through what people in town might ask and how simple answers work best. She decided she would say, I keep house at the Hollis place east of the flats. Wages due each week and marked in the book. She practiced the line once under her breath to make sure it came even. Then she got the ledger from the shelf and brought it to the table and waited until Grant came in so she could see him mark the day again, because it wasn't just money, it was proof she existed here in a way that counted. He washed at the basin and saw fresh water and a clean towel set out, and it changed the way his shoulders felt to not have to fetch and fill and wring before eating. He opened the ledger and drew the line for the date and wrote, Board, keep, labor due, with the same figure as yesterday. Then he paused, because a second question had hung at the edge of his thoughts, and it should be cleared before town. If anyone asks where you came from before San Marcos, he said, what answer keeps you safest? She said, tell the truth and keep it short. I work 2 houses and a camp. I left for cause. I don't know coin or favors behind me. He repeated it back so there would be no mistake, then added, if the sheriff or the parson asks anything else, I'll do the talking first, and then you'll add what you want. She agreed. That afternoon, he took her over to meet the neighbors, because people on the land carried news in straight lines, and it was better to set their story clean the first time. The Ridges lived a mile and a half west in a low house with a deep eave and a neat stack of split mesquite under it. They were an old couple, as Grant had said. Mrs. Ridge wore a dark dress with a white collar, and Mr. Ridge had a back that bent, but eyes that missed nothing. Introductions were quiet and exact. Housekeeper and cook on wages, Grant said. Mrs. Ridge's face softened at that, and she shook Ann's hand with both of hers and said, you'll find Sundays slow if you don't lay out the day right. Best to set dough at breakfast. It was the kind of advice a woman gave another when she meant welcome. Mr. Ridge looked at Grant and said, tin on your south eave still good? And Grant answered, tight for now, and saw how a whole winter's worth of peace could sit in 4 sentences like that. Saturday came with a thin haze and no wind, so the road dust would rise only a little, and braided her hair back and put on the cleanest dress she had, and mended the hem where it would not show. She wrapped her shawl close and stepped in a yard in boots that were too loose and stuffed with rag at the toe, and she did not like that, but it would not be true for much longer. Grant harnessed the bay, gelding, Bishop, and checked the belly strap twice and the traces once. He laid a blanket on the wagon seat because the planks took the cold. He opened a rifle scabbard and made sure the Winchester sat cleaned and oiled, then closed it and set the latch, not to make a show of protection, but because the road was the road. They rode out with the sun still low, the 7 miles into town taking just over an hour and a half, an easy pace, and kept her hands folded and breathed slow because she had learned it kept nerves from showing at the mouth. They stopped first at the parsonage, where the parson had a desk with a big book on it and the kind of careful eyes a man gets from writing names he might have to defend later. Grant spoke first, and watched the parson watch him and then watch her, and she saw the tick where judgment might have started and then did not. The parson wrote, and Carver, housekeeper at the Hollis Ranch, wages due, and had her sign, and she did in a clear hand because that was something the mission taught her well. The parson added the date and his initials, and then a short note that said, comes recommended by Mr. and Mrs. Ridge, because he had asked and Grant had told him they had stopped there. The parson folded a small scrap with the same note and handed it to and said, show it if anyone makes trouble. She slid it into her pocket with the key and felt her back set straighter. At the mercantile, the clerk, Mr. Tully, was a man who liked knowing who was buying what, and he tried to lean himself into the space between questions and answers the way clerks do when they have too much time. Grant's voice stayed level. Flour, 25 pounds. Coffee. Lamp wick. Soap. 8-penny nails. Tar paper if you have it. Needles and thread, coarse and fine. And a yard and a half of warm calico. And added without looking at Grant first, because the list was hers too. Salt, 2 blocks. A new tin for baking because the old one sticks. And if you've got boots in a women's 5, broad in the forefoot. Mr. Tully tried to glance at her feet, and she lifted her chin just enough that he looked away and got the boots down. She tried them on with her stockings, and they fit with a little room for thick socks. She saw Grant, watching only to check fit and not to measure her, which eased a current of tension she had carried all the way from San Marcos. At the blacksmith's, she asked for a duplicate of the small iron key. The smith, Doyle, cut one while Grant waited with the horse. Doyle asked if there was trouble, and then said, "No, only order," and that answer pleased the man. He handed her 2 keys and a length of leather to tie one, so it would not be lost, and he waved off the coin for the leather because he liked the word order and wanted to see more of it in town. They passed the saloon on the way back, and no one called out at them, because it was early and because Grant did not look left or right. The sheriff nodded from the boardwalk, and Grant tipped his hat and kept going, and kept her eyes on the wagon bed where the flour and coffee sat in a neat stack because it kept her breathing even. On the ride home, she asked the question she had been holding in case the day had turned poorly. "If someone from before asks for me here," he said, "they'll ask me first. And if they don't, I'll step in front of them. You'll speak if you choose, and I'll back you." She turned that over and felt the part in her that had learned to cut and run relax a notch, because she believed him. When they rolled into the yard, the sun had shifted toward afternoon, and Bishop shook his head and snorted, and laughed once at the sound, because it meant food and shelter to the animal and to her too in its way. She helped carry sacks into the pantry and set each item on its line on the scrap with prices beside them, so the ledger would match. Grant checked the herd at dusk and counted 23 head with 2 calves near weaning. And he told her that when he came in, because people under the same roof should know what kept them fed. She told him the seals on the jars were good except one, and she had boiled that one and used it for stew already, so there was no waste. He showed her where he kept the shotgun in the bedroom closet and the box of cartridges high on a shelf. He said, "If you're here alone and need it, it'll fire clean. It kicks hard. Keep your shoulder tight." She said, "I can handle it." And he believed her because nothing she had done had been for show. As the light went down, they set a new rule not because of trouble, but because clear lines kept trouble from starting. On Saturdays after town, they would always check the parson's scrap and the church book if needed. They would look over the pantry and the ledger together and sign the line for wages due side by side, so that if illness or talk came, no one could twist figures against them. They would not let the stove die before 9 unless a hard wind made it necessary. And on Sundays, they would eat hot in the morning and cold at noon, and drink coffee on the porch for as long as the sun allowed before chores pulled them up again, and took her new boots off and set them side by side under her bed. She tied one of the keys to a strip of leather and looped it around her wrist while she slept, because the habit would keep it from being lost even if she dreamed badly. Grant wrote the day's purchases in the ledger and the price of the duplicate key and the stamp at the parson's. Under the line for wages, he wrote, "Witnessed by Parson," and initialed it, then slid the book back into place. They banked the fire and checked the latches. The house held the clean tiredness of a day spent doing things that could be pointed to. The questions that had hung open were answered in the course of work and not speeches. What her name was, what stood in the box, what would be said in town, who carried paper proof, how many cattle fed them, who would speak if an old trouble stepped onto the porch. And sleep came down without fuss, because tomorrow had shape and the road into it was straight enough to walk without looking over a shoulder every third step. Cold moved in before dawn and laid a tight edge on every metal thing in the yard, the pump handle stiff at first pull and the gate hinge giving a short cry that told of dry iron. And had the stove going and the coffee thin, but hot by the time Grant came in from checking the barn latch and rubbing frost for Bishop's mane. They ate cornbread fried in lard with a spoon of last night's beans, then set the day the way they had begun to do, clear and with no extra talk. She would boil linens and scrub the floor by halves so the boards wouldn't warp, cut the calico, and start curtains for the 2 front windows, put a pot on low with dried beans and a heel of salt pork, so the house would smell like a place that planned ahead. He would look over the lean-to roof where a seam had lifted, fix the loose tread on the porch, and walk the north fence to see if a coyote had worked under. Before he went out, he took the Winchester from the closet and laid on the table with the breech open and the magazine empty and said, "You should know it by feel," and stood square to it, not eager and not afraid. He showed her how the lever moved, where the hammer sat, how the front sight should sit low on what she meant to hit. He pressed the butt to her shoulder and told her to keep the wood tight so the kick wouldn't bruise. He handed her a spent shell and had her cycle it so the motion would set in her hands. She did it twice smooth, one ragged, then smooth again. He watched her face for any sign the gun brought back a bad memory and saw none, only focus and a small line of relief as the pieces made sense. He said, "If I'm laid up or late past sundown, you light both lamps in the front windows and sit with this where you can reach it, and don't open to any voice that won't give a name." And she said, "Understood," because the rule was simple and kept the house safe. By mid-morning, a rider came slow up the track, the sound of hooves steady and not hurrying. Grant stepped onto the porch and stood just inside the door with the key in her pocket and her hand resting easy on the table. The horse stopped at the well, and Sheriff Ezra Logan tipped his hat in that quiet way a man does when he isn't hunting trouble. "Morning, Hollis," he said. "Saw your wagon in town yesterday. Thought I'd ride out and learn the shape of things so I can answer talk with facts." Grant nodded once and said, "Housekeeper on wages, names and carver." Parson wrote it in his book and gave her a slip, and brought the folded scrap, handed it through the door. The sheriff read it, checked the signature, handed it back. "That'll do," he said. Then he asked the one hard question without heat, eyes on her face. "Anyone coming after you?" And answered in a plain voice. "No claim behind me. No coin owed. Foreman who bother me has a camp moving south and a whole line of other women to trouble. I left clean." Logan took that in, looked once at the tidy wood stack and the broom hanging where it should, and said, "Sunday service is quiet this month. If you come in and want a seat near the back, nobody'll mind. Keep me in your path if talk gets loud." He touched the brim again and turned his horse. The visit done in under 5 minutes. The question many people would ask now answered with paper and a lawman's eyes on record. Grant set the ladder to the lean-to while and held it firm with both hands. He went up with a hammer and cut nails and a strip of tar paper and set the seam down where wind had got under. When he called for the roll, she passed it and kept her eyes on his boots and the rung and the place his hand would go next. He worked quick because the sky had a look that said snow, without drama, only the kind that comes early and thin. He came down without slip, and they checked the edge by pushing up on it with 4 fingers until it didn't give. He took the ladder to the side of the house and followed with the hammer, because she had learned that tool in hand-cut steps in half. Inside, she set a tub on the stove rail and boiled the linens, worked the bar of soap down to a thin wedge and still got a good lather, then rinsed it till the water ran clear and hung everything on the line under the porch where a breeze would dry without freezing. She cut the calico wide to allow for shrink and ran a straight seam by hand with small, even stitches. She measured twice between window casings so the curtains would meet in the middle without dragging over the sill. She did not fuss them with lace, because lace eats time and dust. When Grant came in for water, she held the half-finished panel up, and he said, "Good," with a look that belonged to a man who had not seen a new thing.
Thank you so much
made in
for
his
hanging
house
out
in a
with
long
Where Grit
while.
Meets Heart.
Afternoon,
Don't
he
forget
showed
to
her how to
like,
hitch Bishop
share,
and
and
drive the
subscribe
wagon
so you
at a
don't
walk
miss out
along
on
the
what's
fence
next.
line behind
See
the
you
house.
soon.
She sat on the seat with both hands set light on the lines, learned how a small squeeze meant turn and a slack meant straight. He walked beside the wheel the first time, jogged a few steps the second, then climbed up and let her keep the lines with him sitting near and saying nothing unless needed. She backed the wagon to the stacked rails without grinding a hub. He said, "Again," and they did it twice more. By the last pass, she breathed easier and her shoulders dropped, and he realized he had been holding his own breath a little and let it go. The lesson not about errands, but about what she could do if he was down and something needed doing that couldn't wait. He took a short board and planed it smooth in the yard, bored 2 holes, and pinned it with oak dowels to the wall near the door to make a fresh peg rail, because the old one ran short of pegs for two people's coats, and sanded the edges with a scrap of paper until her thumb didn't catch. He rubbed the wood with the last of a tin of linseed, and the grain rose clean. They set it high enough that a coat wouldn't drag the floor and low enough that she could reach it without stretch. They put one peg to his hat, one to her shawl, and left two open for whatever would come next. The kind of small change that shifts a room's shape without arguing with the past. At late afternoon, he looked toward the cottonwood and then toward the small room and said what listeners would want set plain and what had been held back in respect. Her name was Ellen, and he kept his eyes on the yard when he said it. Fever took her inside a week. Hands swelled and the ring wouldn't fit. I put it in that box with her letters and the shawl. I don't mean to forget, and I don't want a ghost running the house. And stayed quiet in the space after that because there was nothing to fix, only a fact to set down and leave. Then she said, "Curtains will keep the drafts off the table by supper. That'll help," which was the right way to stand beside the truth without stepping on it. A coyote cut across the north fence near sundown, and Bishop threw his head in the stall. Grant took the rifle and stepped to the yard, didn't fire, only sent a shout that carried, and watched the animal lift and run the fence line until it found the wash and dropped out of sight. He checked the wire where the run had passed and tamped a loose post with the back of the shovel. He came in and told her where and why, so she'd know the shape of thread around them. She told him the beans would be ready after dark and that she had salted them light to make the meat stretch 2 days. When the first flakes started thick enough to show, he banked the fire a little higher, and she shut the curtains, and the room held heat better than it ever had through a storm. They ate with sleeves rolled in steam on their faces and made a small change to their Saturday rule because of what the sheriff had said. After town, they would stop at his office if he was in and say hello and let him see them together. Nothing more, just enough that a man with a badge would have a fresh picture to set against talk. Grant wrote it alongside the list tacked inside the pantry door so they wouldn't forget and so any eye nosing around would find order staring back. He also wrote a short note and signed it. And Carver may draw up to $2 against our account at Tully's for food, soap, lamp wick, or thread if I'm laid up, and folded it into the parson's slip because paper saves time when a body is hurt or the weather shuts a road. Before turning in, and hung the finished curtains and tied them back with 2 strips she had cut from the leftover cloth. Grant stood 2 steps back and looked, not for show and not to praise, just to let his eyes learn the new shape. The light from the lamp sat softer against the glass, and the draft along the floor eased. He said, "That was needed," and she said, "Yes," and took up the second panel for the other window and kept stitching until the seams met smooth. He set the plain board he'd used for the peg rail aside and said, "Tomorrow I'll box the porch shred so it doesn't creak when you cross at night," and she said, "Good, I stepped softer, but it still speaks. Small talk that is really planning." They checked the latches as always. She set the key on the washstand where her hand would find it in the dark. He returned the rifle to the closet with the breech open and the cartridges high. They spoke the next day out loud. She would finish the second curtain before breakfast. He would salt the cattle and check the east trough. They would write 3 letters on scrap. One to the Ridges with thanks for the reference, one to the parson noting the sheriff's stop, and one to Mr. Tully listing any credit drawn so the ledger could match without a gap. Because speaking a plan is how you keep fear from filling a room that is quiet. When they lay down, sleep came clean and without turns. The questions that had hung after town now set in order. The lawn knew her name and why she was there. The neighbors knew the shape of the arrangement. A lawman had looked at her eyes and at the paper and found no trouble. She could work the rifle if needed and the wagon if he was hurt. The box in the small room held Ellen's things and would be left as it was without argument. The house had a new peg rail with 2 pegs filled and 2 left open, and the windows wore curtains that kept warmth. Where it belonged. Nothing grand had happened. Nothing needed to. The work of making a place hold 2 people had moved forward a few inches, and those inches mattered enough to count. Snow set a thin crust over the yard before sunup, and the trough wore a skin of ice that Grant broke with the back of a shovel while his breath came hard in the cold. Inside the house, and had beans warming slow, coffee on the back of the stove, and a pan ready to bake a coarse loaf. She checked the curtains she had hung the night before and felt the draft had eased. She laid a damp cloth over the dough and rubbed her hands to bring the feeling back to her fingers. She touched the key at her wrist to be sure it was there, because sleeping with it tied on had already turned into habit. When Grant came in, he hung his hat on the new peg without thinking, and that small automatic movement told both of them the board belonged. They ate quick, scrambled egg from what Mrs. Ridge had sent over last week, a heel of last night's cornbread fried in lard, coffee thin but steady, and set the day's list in the same, even way that kept worry from filling the quiet. He would box the porch tread so it would not speak at night, add a brace to the lean-to post, check the north fence for fresh dig marks, and trim a low limb by the cottonwood before ice could snap it. She would finish the second set of curtains, cut a draft snake from calico and flour sack ticking, and fill it with clean sand for the door, boil the last of the linens, and start a stew that could carry 2 days if stretched with dumplings. Then they would walk to the cottonwood after midday and tend the grave, because leaving it to weather was not how either of them wanted to live. Grant brought the Winchester to the table again and run the lever 5 times with spent shells so the feel sat right in her hands. He watched for any tremor that looked like fear and saw none, only concentration and a small exhale when the rhythm landed. If someone rides up and I'm out, you stand where you can reach the latch and see the yard, he said. Name first, business second. If either comes wrong, you shut the door and set the bar. She said, understood, and added what she had thought through in the night. If I'm the one late back from the line or the well, you light both lamps and leave the front door barred. I'll knock twice, then once, then say my name. I won't come in on surprise. They both felt the edge come off a shared concern, because rules named in daylight ran better than guesses after dark. By mid-morning, the porch tread ran quiet after Grant boxed the joist and set 2 screws through a new cleat. He shaved the edge of the board smooth so a boot heel wouldn't catch and tested it with his full weight until it held. He cut a brace for the lean-to and set it with a mallet and 2 lag screws, and tarred the heads so water wouldn't find them. While he worked and finished the second set of curtains, hemmed both with small, even stitches, then sewed the draft snake and eased sand into it through a paper funnel until it was firm but could bend. She laid it tight against the threshold, and the line of cold stopped there. She felt a practical satisfaction move through her chest that was not pride so much as proof that the house was answering back when given the right work. She took the ledger down and laid it flat. Let's mark the week clean, she said, and Grant wiped his hands and wrote the date and the same figure as the 2 days prior. Then he opened a small tobacco tin and counted out 2 silver quarters and 3 dimes and set them on the table. Cash on hand against wages due, he said. I'll add to it when we sell a steer or when I run a bit of fence for the ridges. We'll square every Saturday, and if you ever need to walk out, you do it with coin and not just a slip. And felt the heat rise in her face and tamped it down, not from shame, but because clean fairness carried its own weight. She slid the coins into a cloth purse and set it under the lining of her trunk, and locked the trunk because that was how you treated money that needed to stretch. There were things listeners might have wondered about her past that she had left plain on purpose and now chose to fill without drama while her hands were busy at the stove. First ranch I worked at belonged to a widow who wanted a second pair of hands to keep her boys and shoes and the pantry in order. She married again, and the new man's sister took the work. There was nothing dirty in it, and I left with a fair handshake. The mission school taught me letters and sums and how to carry myself. San Marcos was where the trouble started, and I said no and kept walking. She cut carrots straight into the pot and added a strip of salt pork and 2 bay leaves from the small jar she'd had since summer, and then gave one more fact people always ask first, and she had waited to share until the house felt like it could hold it. Carver is mine, not a husband's. I've got a brother somewhere east and no claim on him. I answer for myself. Grant nodded once and accepted it in that exact size, not more, not less. They walked to the cottonwood afternoon with a small bundle wrapped in clean cloth. The snow made a thin sugar line on the top rail and on the marker. Grant swept the board clear with his palm and set a new flat stone on the mound out of habit, and knelt and opened the cloth and took out 3 things. The button she had found behind the stove baseboard, a sprig of dried sage, and 2 small pieces of bread she had baked on their second day. because food left to the weather does not draw animals the way meat does. She set them neat and stood with her hands folded and said nothing. Grant stood next to her and spoke the part that mattered to him and to any listener who had wondered how the old and the new would share a roof. Ellen, I'm keeping the place straight and warm. There's a woman here by the name of, and who keeps it too. I will honor you, and I will not ask a ghost to run my days. He swallowed once and kept his eyes on the ground until his breath evened, and did not touch him, because unasked touch near a grave feels wrong. But she stayed until he turned, and they walked back together without hurry. A stray dog drifted into the yard from the fence line near mid-afternoon, ribs showing but eyes clear, a rangy brown mongrel with a torn ear. It stood 10 paces off and watched, and then looked at Bishop and then at the open space under the porch, and crouched and held her hand out, but no closer. Grant kept his voice even. We could use a set of ears that hear what we don't, he said. It'll eat scraps and learn the yard inside a week. They left a crust and a bit of fat 2 steps from the porch and went about their work without looking. By dusk, the dog had taken the food and curled under the porch with its nose on its paws. No one named it, because names come after a thing has proved it means to stay. Grant trimmed the low cottonwood limb and stacked the cut for kindling, then walked the north fence and found 2 places where something had started to dig and tamped the loose earth hard with the back of the shovel. He checked the line tension with a gloved hand and listened for the clean twang that said it would hold. He counted the herd again, 23 head tight to the lee of the windbreak, no sign of cat or man. As he came in, he found himself thinking forward through December with, and in every picture, 2 bowls, 2 cups, 2 pairs of boots by the door, and he did not push that thought away, because it was not fancy, just the truth of how the place ran now. And finished the linens, wrung them, hung them under the porch where ice would not catch them, then took Grant's patched shirt from the peg and set 2 more rows of stitching around the elbow patch, because that spot takes strain when a man leans into a fence post or a hammer. She checked the pantry and added soap, sack, and candle stubs to the list, because the days were drawing in and lamp oil ran faster in winter. She folded a clean towel and set it on the washstand in the small room and hesitated at the dresser, then spoke what had sat her mind since he'd said Ellen's name the day before. If you want that box out of here and in your room, I'm ready for that. Not because it troubles me to share space with it, but because it may sit easier where you sleep. Grant came to the doorway and looked at the box and then waited. I'll move it after supper, he said, and that was the right time. Not rushed, not delayed to avoid the work. They ate stew with dumplings and steam on their faces. The dog under the porch thumped once with its tail at the smell. Bishop shifted in the stall and stamped and settled. They spoke the next week out loud, so nothing important lived only in their heads. Saturday they would go to town again, stop with the parson, and, if the sheriff was in, with him as well. At the mercantile, they would add a 2nd pair of work gloves, more needles, and, if coin allowed, a proper door latch for the small room, so the key would not be the only way to feel secure. They would ask Doyle to look at the wagon wheel hub that had started to squeak at slow turns, and if the weather held, they would stop by the ridges with a loaf and thanks for the eggs and the reference. After dishes, they moved the box together, because that was how to handle something that had weight but did not need drama. Grant lifted it with both hands and cleared the dresser top in his room and set a folded cloth so the wood would not scrape. He set the box down, laid his palm on the lid once, and left it shut. He wiped his hands on his trousers and stood a second until the tightness in his jaw let go, and did not speak a comfort, because words like that spill and leave a mess. She simply set the clean towel back on her own washstand and retied the key around her wrist and felt her room read more fully as hers without the old life pressed into its corners. Before they turned in, they fixed one more hole listeners might have worried over. What if sickness laid one of them low in weather that kept the road shut? Grant wrote the names Ridge and Logan on a scrap with the word fetch and pinned it by the door. If I can't stand, you send the dog or ride Bishop to the ridges and they'll bring the doctor. If you can't stand, I'll light both lamps and put a scarf on the fence for a sign and ride in, he said. And she added, I'll keep a kettle and rags on in winter for fever as a rule, which sounded like superstition to some and like sound practice to anyone who had nursed a body through a cold season. They set a wash basin with fresh water within reach of both beds and laid out clean cloths, because thinking ahead steals power from fear. They checked latches, set the bar, banked the fire, and said good night in the straightforward way of people who had worked enough to be tired and not used up. In her room, and untied the key and set on a washstand and held her coin purse a second and put it back. She looked at the door and at the draft snake and felt safe in a way that did not make her careless, but did let her shoulders drop. In his room, Grant looked at the box once, and then at the peg with his hat and at the peg with her shawl, and he felt the house settle around the shape of two people who were not kin and not charity and not problem, and who had set terms and met them. The snow outside caught what little light remained, and the yard went quiet. The dog lifted its head and laid it down again. The mule kick of loneliness that had been his habit for 3 winters did not land, and sleep came without trouble, because the work of the day had answered the questions left hanging. What her name stood for, whether the lawn knew it, who would come if illness hit, how the past would be honored and not allowed to run the table, what sound would wake them if danger stepped on the path. And the next morning was already drawn tight and simple enough to walk into without flinching. The cold held through morning and bit harder by noon, a clear sky that looked harmless until your lungs pulled it in and burned. Grant salted the cattle and checked the windbreak, and came back with a cough he said was nothing. He stripped his gloves and warmed his hands at the stove, and he would take the axe to the cottonwood rounds after he ate. She watched the way he set his jaw and how he steadied himself on the chair back before sitting, and she marked it, not to scold, just to set a line in her head of what shape the day might take if his nothing grew teeth. They ate thick slices of yesterday's loaf with beans, and he stood to go, and she put the kettle on without comment and set a stack of clean rags near the stove because plans made in calm carry a house when a day turns. By early afternoon, he was swinging the axe slower than he liked, and he knew it, and pushed through because the pile should be high before dark. The air cut his throat, and a chill got into his shoulders and sat there. He finished the round he had started and leaned the axe against the splitting block and told himself he would only sit on the porch rail long enough to catch his breath. He woke 3 minutes later to the sound of the dog trotting from under the porch and Anne's boots on the steps. The dog nudged his boot once, and said his name, level but louder than usual. He stood too quick, and the yard went gray at the edges, and he had to set a hand to the post. Anger at his own body flashed through him and then drained away because anger didn't fix anything. He nodded once. "I've got it," he said, and heard the rasp in his own voice. Inside, she brought the chair near the stove and pressed the back of her hand to his forehead and didn't say fever. She said, "Sit," and he sat because arguing would waste breath he didn't have. She laid a cool cloth over his neck and put willow bark steeping in a mug and set the kettle to a slow boil. Her thoughts kept their order the way she trained them to in the missions. Count the steps, set a tool, watch the breath, don't scare the patient with your face. She opened both front curtains wide to take what weak sun there was, and then drew them shut again to hold the heat. She checked the latch twice and set the draft snake tight to the door. She wrapped his shoulders in a blanket and watched his hands for tremor. When he closed his eyes, she let him. When he coughed, she steadied the mug so he wouldn't splash and handed it back without fuss. Grant measured himself like he would a sick calf, without self-pity, throat raw, heat behind the eyes, a chill he couldn't shake, muscles burning as if he had been riding hard when he hadn't. He hated the way his mind drifted, and he pulled it back with numbers. How many head at the windbreak? How many posts from the north wash to the gate? He thought of the box he had moved last night and felt relief that it sat where it should, out of her room. He watched and moved through the kitchen and saw skill and no show. He felt something tight in him loosen because the house would hold with her hands on it if he went flat for a day or two. He let that fact land without shame. "If I don't come up by dark, light both front lamps," he said, and she answered, "Already planned," and that calmed him in a way medicine did not. The dog's ears went up near dusk, and it gave a low sound from its chest, and lifted the Winchester from its place with the breech open, checked the chamber, moved to the window without letting her shadow cross the glass. 2 coyotes trotted the fence line, quick glances at the herd, more curious than desperate. Bishop stamped and threw his head. and weighed the house. Sick man in the chair, herd pressed tight, but steady, coyotes testing. She set the rifle down and took the shotgun, because a wide pattern ends a question faster at close range. She stepped onto the porch, braced her shoulder the way Grant had shown, fired once high over the fence, sound hard and flat in the cold air. The coyotes broke and ran the draw. The dog barked twice, sharp and settled, and reloaded without hurry. Checked the wire at the corner for fresh dig and saw none. Went back inside and closed the door and set the bar and looked once at Grant to see what the shot had taken from him. Nothing. He had slept through it the way sick sleep closes a man in. She set a tin cup of broth to warm and a basin of water to cool and counted the hours. One rag on the neck, one across the forehead. Fresh water when his lips cracked. A dry blanket when the first one went damp with sweat. She kept the ledger on the table and ran her finger under the last entry, as if it were a line in a book to keep her place in the night. Not for money, for proof that the day before had been clean and that this one would be too by the time it ended. Twice she considered the mile and a half to the ridges and weighed it against the drop in temperature and the light snow starting to dust the rail, and she marked both times to check again in an hour. She didn't wake him to ask if he wanted the doctor. She watched his breath and his color in his hands and made the call the way a woman alone must. If the breath shortened or his skin went gray, she would hitch Bishop and go. For now she would sit and keep the lamp low and the kettle on. Near midnight, the fever peaked and broke. It came in a rush that soaked the blanket and brought a long, low sound from deep in his chest, the kind a man makes when his body fights and wins or loses. She changed the cloths and turned the blanket and got a dry one around him without jarring the chair. He shivered once and then went loose with the first real sleep since noon. She pushed a stray lock of hair off his forehead with the back of her fingers. Not a caress, a practical move to get the cloth set right, and pulled the chair a half pace back so she could keep the heat from smothering him. She kept her ears open for the yard, the dog, the fence line, the kettle, the stove tick, the small sounds that tell a house it is still in its own hands. When she could leave him for a minute, she stepped to the back room, checked the shotgun again, set 2 shells on the table in a saucer where her hand could find them in the dark, tied the key back around her wrist because tired minds drop things, looked at the small mirror and saw the day on her face, and did not waste time trying to wash it off. She sat by the door with the chair, tipped back 2 inches, the rifle across her lap, and let herself close her eyes for the count of 20 while the kettle murmured. Then she rose and traded the cooled cloths for warm, fed him small sips when his mouth moved, and reset the blanket. The work repetitive but good, the kind that keeps panic out of a room. Morning put a thin line of pale over the window, and his eyes opened clean, no drift. He looked at the curtains and at the lamp and then at her and nodded once, a little embarrassed to be in a chair and not at the pump. "How bad?" he asked, voice low. "High for a spell. Broke near midnight," she said, and didn't make more of it. He tried to stand and sat back because the ground shifted for a second. Anger flickered in him again and went, replaced by the uneasy gratitude he did not like showing. "You kept it," he said, and left the sentence unfinished because the rest would be too much for early light. She poured him a small cup of tea and a half bowl of broth and set it where he could reach without leaning. He watched her move, and a clear thought took shape through the fog in his head. If last winter had gone like this, he would have been alone, and the stove would have gone low, and the trough would have iced hard, and the cattle would have worried the fence. This winter would not go that way if he had anything to say. "We won't cut Saturday town," he said, steadying his voice. "Door latch for your room. More soap, more willow bark, and you'll bring the ledger and sign the wage line yourself in front of the parson. Not because I doubt it, but because paper shuts talk faster than men do." And she said, "All right," and let a piece of relief show in her face, because the plan meant he wasn't going to pretend none of last night mattered. She set the chair near the window and drew the curtain a hand's breadth to give him a way to watch the yard without standing. She put Bishop on a short lead to the inner rail so the gelding could nose a water bucket without pushing the door latch. She checked the herd and counted without writing. 2 calves nosing each other under the windbreak, the rest tight to the lee. She ran her hand once over the dog's back and felt hard ribs under coarse fur, and decided, not out loud, that scraps weren't enough anymore. She dug a shallow trench near the porch and set a board over it with one side open to make a dry place out of the wind, and lined it with straw from behind the stall and set a tin of water under the board where it wouldn't ice. The dog stood watching with its head cocked, not quite trusting gifts, and then lay in the straw with a sound that wasn't a whine, more like a man settling after a long walk. She tried a name, Patch, and didn't repeat it. The dog's ear flicked and then went still. Questions had been asked in town about what she did and where she slept and whether she could read and whether a woman hired on a loan could handle trouble if it came. Last night had answered most of that for her own mind and for the house, even if town never heard it. She washed the used cloths and set them to dry, tore a length of calico into neat strips for the next fever if it came, refilled the basin, cleared the ashes, set fresh coals, made a small pot of porridge that would sit warm all morning and not sour, and wrote a new line for the pantry list, quinine if Parson's wife knows source, because some church women kept supplies to Mercantile too often overpriced. By afternoon, he pushed for the door, and she led him to the porch and no farther. He felt the cold on his face like a truth he could stand. He laid a hand on the new peg rail and the smooth edge of the box tread and the draft snake, and saw his house through somebody else's eyes for the first time in a long while. Curtains that kept heat, a latch that would soon be bought, a plan tacked to a door, a slip from the parson folded with the key, a ledger with two hands writing in it, and the embarrassment he carried about needing help eased, not because he liked being weak, but because the help had come from order and not pity. "You fired," he said, looking toward the north fence line. "Once high. Coyotes moved on," she said, and he let that sit where it belonged. Part of the day's work, nothing for pride to chew on. Toward evening, the sheriff rode up slow again on his circuit and saw Grant on the porch and tipped his hat. "You look less like a ghost than I was told," he said, eyes laughing without mockery, and met him at the door with the parson's slip in one hand and the ledger in the other, like two stones that made a wall against meddling. "Fever, not catching," she said on purpose in case he worried for town. Logan nodded and kept his horse off the porch and said, "If you need a ride sent to the ridges and your horse won't do it, hang a shirt from the corner post, and I'll watch for it twice a day until this weather changes." And said, "We set a scarf for that. Thank you." And Logan's mouth crooked in a way that said the talk in his office would be short if anyone started it. They ate plain that night, porridge for him, a smaller bowl of beans for her, and they spoke Saturday out loud again so it would hold. Parson first, Mercantile second, Blacksmith third if the wagon hub kept speaking at slow turns, Ridges last with a loaf and thanks and a note about the fever for their caution, and would walk two lists, one for the counter and one in her head for how people looked and what they might say later, so she could know in advance what paper to carry next time. Grant would say what needed saying and leave the rest to her, because she had shown she could close a door with fewer words than most men needed. Before sleep, she loosened the key from her wrist and set it on the washstand and measured out a spoon of willow bark for morning in case the fever tried to climb again. She left the shotgun leaning inside the door where her hand could find it in one step. She checked the tin of water under the board for Patch and found it half gone and filled it. In his room, Grant sat on the edge of the bed a minute and let himself feel the small wash of shame for giving trouble, and then set it down because it didn't help. He drew the blanket up and said, "You kept the house," and meant more than the stove and the latch. She said, "You'll be on your feet by Saturday if you don't pick up that axe tomorrow." And he said, "I hear you," which was as much concession as he could make without losing his shape. The house went quiet in a clean way, not empty, just set. The rules they had written in daylight had held through a night that could have pulled them apart. The questions that hung after earlier chapters, their plan for sickness, whether the rifle training meant anything, if the dog would earn a place, how far the law stood from the door, whether paper would be used or just talked about, were answered by use and not speeches. And the next day lay clear enough to walk into without guessing. 2 lamps ready for dusk. A wagon that would creak into town with both of their names written where names counted, and a tired man who had learned that being guarded and being cared for could live in the same house without a fight. Saturday held clear and cold without wind, and that was the kind of weather you could work in. Grant woke with the heaviness gone from his limbs and the heat out of his eyes, and he said he was fit to drive, and looked him over like a nurse and like a partner and said yes, so long as he let the day stay easy. She packed a loaf wrapped in cloth for the ridges and folded the parson's slip and the note about store credit into her pocket with the key and a short list. She checked the shotgun and left it breech open by the door and set an extra bucket under the board for patch and tied the gate pin with a strip of leather so it would not swing in a gust. She laid a clean scarf on the porch rail in case the sheriff rode by and needed a sign of absence, and then took it down again because they were not gone yet. Grant greased the wagon hub with what Doyle had given him last month and tightened the trace chain one link, and they rolled out slow with Bishop fresh and willing and the dog watching them from under the porch with its head on its paws. They stopped first at the parsonage as planned, and the parson set the big book on the desk and turned to a fresh page and wrote the date and in Carver, housekeeper at Hollis Ranch. And then he turned the book and offered the pen to Ann. She signed steady, in a clear hand, and he asked that she also write wages received each Saturday as marked. And she did. And then Grant put his own name to the line next to the figure for the week so that the ink showed both of them agreeing. The parson's wife came from the kitchen with a small paper packet and said it came dear from the apothecary, but she would part with 4 doses of quinine for a fair price and a promise to keep it for need only, and counted the coins from her own purse as due and took the packet and gave thanks and felt a piece of unease slide off her shoulders because now fever did not feel like a visitor that could not be met. At the mercantile, Mr. Tully leaned forward with both hands on the counter as if his weight could push answers out of people, and Grant gave him the list before any questions could start. Door latch and strike plate, soap, willow bark if you've got it, lamp wick needles, coarse and fine, 2 pairs of work gloves, 1 small baking tin, and added candle stubs or a box of short candles if you'll sell them by the dozen, and a yard of ticking for a second draft snake. Mr. Tully tried to make talk about weather that turned into talk about who had hired on at which ranch, and he slid an eye toward Ann's hands and asked, in a voice he thought was mild, whether she could read the bill of sale. She laid the parson's slip and the store credit note on the counter without changing her face and said, "I read the bill in the ledger, and my name is on both." Mr. Tully's mouth closed by a small measure, and he wrote figures where she could see and called them out, and did not try to round a dime into a quarter because the paper made him careful. The boots she had bought last week got a nod from an older woman buying salt, and in return the nod, and the woman said nothing else, which was the kind of help that keeps peace in a town. Outside the blacksmith's, Doyle had the forge bright and the air close with heat, and he lifted the wheel and spun it and listened, and then set a sliver of hickory into the hub where it had started to speak its slow turns and peened a washer down until the slack was gone. "Grease it when the weather breaks," he told Grant. "Not so much today, or it'll stiffen on you." And he took the note Grant had written about and drawing up to $2 for food or wick or thread and tucked it into a cigar tin under the counter and told, "And you show me this and I'll mark it in my book and in yours. I like clean lines." And she said, "So do I." And that ended it. They crossed the boardwalk toward the wagon, and a man leaning against a post lifted his chin at, and in the way a man does when he is searching for a memory, he'd rather be true, and said, "Didn't you pass through San Marcos camp?" Not loud, not friendly. And the sheriff stepped out of his office door because he had seen them through the glass, and he said, "Morning, Miss Carver, Mr. Hollis," and put his eyes on the man without raising his voice and said, "You lost day?" The man shrugged like a dog that has been told to back off one too many times and said he must have been thinking of somebody else, and kept her eyes on the wagon bed and climbed up and set the ticking and the latch and the packet of quinine where they would not slide. And Grant set the gloves on top and thanked the sheriff in the tone men use when a thing has been handled and does not need more talk. They rolled onto the ridges and left the loaf and stood through 5 minutes of advice about winter knees and the way to keep a pump from freezing by propping the handle, and they promised to stop next Sunday with news. The road home went clean and quiet, with the gelding's breath showing white and the hub moving without complaint, and watched the flats and thought through what had almost happened at the post, and felt how quickly paper and a calm badge had turned a question aside. She did not picture what a different day would have looked like, because that is how dread grows, She pictured the latch installed on her door and the parson's line in the big book instead, and let those images fill the space where fear likes to sit. Grant drove with his gloves on and the weight back in his hands, and told her one thing she had not asked for but would want later. If I don't make a spring for some reason that is not in my plan, Ridges will ride to the county seat with you, and the deed will be in your hands and in mine while I can sign it. That's later, not now, but I want it said. She held that without answering, because some facts sit better when they are left standing a while. She folded the thought next to the packet of quinine and the key. They pulled up at the porch with light enough to work. Grant carried the latch and the strike plate and the chisel and set them on the washstand in her room, and measured twice so the metal would seat and not split the style. He marked a straight line with a soft pencil, cut clean, set the plate, and drove the screws home until they bit. The tongue fell into the plate with a close click that was not loud and not weak, and he stood back and let her close the door and turn the key and open it again, and she did it 3 times to make the sound set in her hand. Her face changed by a small degree that most men would miss, but he did not. It was the look of a body recognizing a boundary as more than a rule on paper. They hung the new gloves on the peg rail and put the wick and soap and needles in their places. She tucked the quinine into a tin high on a shelf and marked the tin with a scrap that said only medicine, so a stranger's hand would not think to open it first. They set the table side by side and ate a pot of beans stretched with dumplings and a spoon of salt pork, and they wrote the day's figures into the ledger. She signed under his line because the parson had asked for that, and it made nonsense talk die fast. They added the cost of the latch and the hickory sliver and the small credit, and then squared it with the coins they had agreed on and left the rest due next week, because winter draws down coin and rises it again slow and careful. When the dishes were stacked, she took her boots off and set them under her bed and looped the key back around her wrist and stood in the doorway of the main room a second and watched the way his shoulders had dropped since morning and the line at his mouth had eased. And she felt the same in herself, and no words came that would say it better than the silence in the room already did. Patch worked his way to the threshold as the light went and lay with his chin on his paws and his eyes on the stove. Bishop blew once in the stall and went quiet. The curtains held the heat where it belonged, and the draft snake did its job. The house felt contained without feeling small, and stood at the stove and checked the kettle and wiped the table with a damp cloth, and he reached for the cup just as she set it down, and his fingers closed over hers, and neither of them moved for a second. No startle, no rush, just a clear sense that there was nothing wrong in the contact and nothing else required to excuse it. He set the cup down and stepped in, with only one breath between them, and kissed her once, slow and close to the stove where the iron clicked and the kettle hummed. And then he stopped and rested his brow against hers, as if to see if the room would hold that as easily as it had held the rules and the winter and the names. It did. She stayed where she was and set her hand against his jaw once, and then let it fall. And they stood that way until the kettle went from hum to soft boil. After, they checked the latches as always, and a new door latch seated with a short sound that was easy to trust. They spoke Sunday out loud. Church if the road stayed passable, and a seat near the back, as the sheriff had said. A stop by Doyle if the hub spoke again. Letters to write to the Ridges and to the parson to note the sheriff's quiet help. A loaf to set in the morning and a pan of cornbread to follow, because a warm noon meal carries a house through a cold afternoon. And then they fell quiet because the list was set and did not need saying twice. They each held, in their own way, the thing that had changed by the stove, and they did not coat it with fine talk or promise more than a day can hold. He said, "Good night," and she said, "Good night, Grant," and the names fit in their mouths like tools that had found the right peg. Before sleep, he laid the Winchester in its place with the breech open and the cartridges high, the way he had taught her, and she set the quinine packet in the tin and set the tin in the same spot twice to make the map of it hold in her tired head. The scarf of the porch rail hung on its peg, ready for a signal, and the sheriff would ride by in the morning because he had said he would, and because that is how a quiet county stays quiet. Questions that had lingered for anyone paying attention were answered without speeches. The wage line bore both their hands in ink. The town saw a lawman stand where he should. The clerk learned where paper sits between commerce and meddling. The latch on her door clicked real and sure. The wheel turned without complaint. The dog had straw and water and a name that would stick if it chose to answer. And two people who had kept their distance because it kept them upright had moved one step closer without breaking that uprightness. The house banked its fire and kept its heat, and the night pressed against the windows and stayed out where it belonged. Sunday held steady and bright with hard cold in the shade. They rode in early because Grant wanted a back pew and wanted a minute to breathe before faces turned. Bishop's breath hung white, and the wheel spoke once at the corner and then went quiet. The parson gave them a nod as they stepped in, and the sheriff lifted 2 fingers from his hat rim and kept his post by the door without making a picture out of it. They sat near the stove where the heat rose in slow waves and kept her gloves folded in her lap and watched the way people let their eyes land and slide off and land again until the hymn started and the room stood. The service ran short the way winter services do. After the amen, Mrs. Ridge came to and with a tin of bread starter and a plane for Sundays. The parson's wife asked if the quinine had been set high away from heat, and said yes, and thanked her by name. Mr. Tully called the account settled proper, in a tone that said the parson's book had done its work. And a ranch hand named Day, who had leaned at the post yesterday, tried to find space in the door light to say he remembered her from San Marcos. He got half the sentence out, and the sheriff stepped once to the side and set his boot between Day's and Ann's line of sight and said, "You're mistaking talk for truth, Day." And Day said he must be, and left it there because the room gave him no place to put the rest. They rolled out with the sun still low and the road dry enough to keep the wagon moving without fight. On the far side of the wash, a heifer bawled in the thin brush, and Grant pulled the reins and stepped down careful and found a calf half through and stuck, frost on the hair at its nose. He looked once at the sky and once at and said, "We finished this here." And she climbed down and set a clean rag from her pocket near the cow's flank and stood to hold the tail and talk low while he worked his hands in. It was slow and ugly and necessary and not the sort of thing people talk about later, but the kind of work that decides whether spring starts with 23 head or 24. When the calf slid free, it went still a heartbeat too long and then rubbed its ribs with both hands until it kicked and sneezed and tried to stand. The cow swung her head and let them back away, and Grant wiped his hands on clean snow and said, out of breath, "Good," and nodded and let the feeling run through her chest like heat. Not triumph, just relief that something that should live was living. At home, they put Bishop to and checked the herd and the wire and the pump, then came inside for coffee while the house warmed up from having sat. And they stood near the stove the way they had the night before, because the place between stove and table had turned into where they measured themselves against the day. Grant took the parson's slip from his pocket and set it on the table and moved the ledger beside it. And for the first time in 3 winters, he reached for the box in his room and brought it out and set it down next to the ledger. He stood a minute with his palm on the lid and let the tightness in his jaw go. "I won't ask a ghost to run this house," he said quietly. He lifted the lid and took out the letters and the shawl and left them as they were, then set the small ring in his hand. He looked at it as if weighing it against the whole room. He turned to and, "I could buy a brass band at Tully's tomorrow, or I can ask with nothing in my hand and go to the parson anyway. But I don't want you to think this ring makes you a replacement or a duty. It is only a circle that was set aside when fever swelled a hand, and I have kept it as proof of a promise kept. I want to make a new promise, and I want it to be plain and clean." And looked at the ring and then at him, and then down at the ledger where her name stood in ink, and then at the parson's slip and the packet of quinine and the key on its thong and the new door latch and everything that had made the last days steady. She felt the piece of her that waited to be told to leave go still. "If we do this," she said, voice level, "we do it with the parson and with 2 witnesses. We don't hide it or pretend it is something else. We tell the sheriff and the Ridges because they have stood straight for us. And we keep the ledgers as they are because a paper trail shuts talk better than a ring does. And if you ever feel like a man who made 2 lives into one too fast, you will say it to me before it turns to a bruise between us." Grant listened to every word and felt the rightness of being checked and met. "Yes," he said, "to all of it." And he held the ring open in his palm like a tool he meant to put to work or set aside by her say. She stepped closer, took his hand in both of hers, and said, "I will marry you tomorrow morning," not soft and not loud. And he let out a breath he had held for months without knowing it. They went to the Ridges first, because a witness should be asked in person, and because Mrs. Ridge would want to lay a hand on Anne's cheek and say a few words about keeping Bread Starter alive through cold spells, which she did. Mr. Ridge said he would be at the parson's desk 5 minutes early with his spectacles so he could read the lines straight. They stopped by the sheriff's office and Grant said, "Morning, Ezra. We'll stand at the parson's desk tomorrow." And the sheriff gave a slow nod that was the exact size of the news. "I'll make my noon rounds past your gate and tip my hat to the new arrangement, so the road learns it quick," he said. Then he added the thing a lawman who sees too many bad joins must say: "If either of you needs a door open or a door shut, you tell me before you try to shoulder it alone." And said, "Understood," and meant it. Afternoon set in tight and cold. They worked because work steadies new decisions. Grant put the chisel back and oiled it, checked the axe edge, and set it aside, because his lungs still had a rough edge and he would not ruin the next day by proving something to himself. And measured ticking and cut a second draft snake for the bedroom doors, because a house with 2 rooms in use loses heat faster. She set a small bundle on the dresser, 2 biscuits and a sprig of sage, because the grave by the cottonwood had a way of sitting in the corner of the room when it needed tending. And at dusk they walked out and set the bundle at the foot of the marker and stood still without trying to say more than they had said yesterday. The sky went the color that means cold coming, and they turned back. Inside, the dog patch had taken a sleeping under the board out of the wind and came to the threshold and put his chin on his paws and looked up at them like he knew the house had changed shape and wanted to hear it. Bishop stamped once in the stall and blew and settled. The lamp made a circle that left the corners clear, and through all of it ran the small hum of the house that has been cleaned and mended and set to rights. They ate stew stretched with dumplings and cut 2 slices of cornbread for tomorrow's pocket and wrote nothing extra in the ledger because there was nothing extra to write. They sat side by side with their shoulders touching and let the quiet say the rest. He reached for her hand and she gave it, and he kissed her once in the sober way a man kisses a woman he has asked to stay through winter and spring and the next winter too. They went to their doors and stopped and looked back and stayed where they were because they meant to walk into the morning clean. Questions that had sat quiet but present for anyone listening closely were handled without speechifying and without leaving gaps. What they would call what was happening between them, how it would be recorded, who would witness, whether the past would be honored without letting it steer the room, what ring would mean or not mean, where the law stood, whether the neighbors stood, whether safety would change with a new word spoken aloud, and whether the work that had built this would continue. After the word, each was answered by a plan made in daylight and backed by names in a book and by 2 people who had learned not to make impossible promises. They set both lamps on the front windowsill and turned the wicks down to a watch light. They checked the latch and the bar and the new door latch with a clean click. They set their clothes out for morning because cold slows fingers. And they slept like people who will be called by name in a room at a set hour and will answer without shame. The house holding their breath and their plans the way a good roof holds snow and lets it melt off slow without breaking anything underneath. Morning came cold and clear with a thin shine on the pump handle and frost crisp on the porch rail. They dressed in their best without fuss, Grant in a pressed work shirt and the clean suspenders, and in her mended dress with a new seam straight down the side and hair braided tight, and they set out with Bishop fresh and willing. The parson's book waited on his desk, and Mr. and Mrs. Ridge were already there. The parson asked 2 questions and got steady answers. He read the short service he read for everyone. They spoke yes without wavering, and signed in Hollis in the register, and Grant signed beside her, and Mr. and Mrs. Ridge set their names under the line as witnesses. Then Grant opened his hand and showed the small brass band he had bought when Tully unlocked the mercantile for him on his way over. "Plain and new," he said, because the words mattered. He slid it onto Anne's finger, and the parson shut the book and said, "Go on, there's wood to split and bread to bake," which was his way of saying it was done. They stepped out, and the sheriff was at the door as he had promised. He touched the brim of his hat and said, "Mrs. Hollis," and then, "Mr. Hollis," and turned to the street so anyone watching would have the picture fixed without being invited to share it. At the mercantile, Mr. Tully said, "Good day to you both," in a tone that gave nothing for gossip to hold, and moved their account into a single ledger page marked Hollis household. Doyle the blacksmith leaned in his doorway and told Grant the wheel would hold through winter if he kept to his grease, and the new latch looked true on the door when he rode past last evening. They left town with the sun still low and the road firm, the packet of quinine set high in the wagon box, the parson's slip folded with their new entry number, the brass band warm on Ann's hand. They stopped by the cottonwood before going inside, because that is what you do when a house changes shape. Grant brushed frost from the marker board with his palm and set a flat stone on the mound, and laid a small sprig of sage and a heel of fresh bread wrapped in clean cloth at the foot, and stood with her hands together. They did not ask permission, and they did not apologize. They stood until each felt the quiet land right, and then went inside. The dog Patch came from under the board and stood in the doorway until and said, "Patch, in," and he came and lay by the stove in a way that said the new order made sense to him, too. Work filled the afternoon because it steadied both of them. Grant set the axe to kindling and stacked 2 neat rows. He checked the windbreak and counted the herd and added 1 to the tally without saying the number out loud, because the calf from yesterday now stood on its own, and set a pot for stew and mixed dough from the starter Mrs. Ridge had given for Sundays, and set it to rise near the back of the stove. She took the household ledger, a fresh book from Tully's, and wrote the first line in a clear hand: Hollis household, stores and stock shared. She closed the wage ledger and slid it onto the high shelf with the parson's first slip inside. "Paid in full through marriage," she said, not soft and not loud. She tied the key to her wrist again out of habit, and then untied it and hung it on the peg by her door because the latch and the brass band had changed the weight of that thong in her mind. Before dusk, they rode the short mile and a half to the Ridges with a warm loaf wrapped in a cloth and thanks. "Mrs. Ridge hugged Anne without asking and said, "Bread needs feeding every day or it sulks," which meant more than bread. Mr. Ridge pressed a folded paper into Grant's hand with the deed clerk's name at the county seat and a line that would save them time in the book there. "Go tomorrow if the weather holds," he said, so talk has no gap to find, and Grant agreed because that was already his plan. The next morning stayed clear, and they rode to the county seat with Bishop steady and unhurried and a blanket over their legs against the cold. The clerk at the land office wore a green eye shade and had hands inked at the fingers. He found the Hollis entry and pulled the old deed and wrote a new notation and penned in and Hollis, spouse, in the owner's line. He had Grant sign and then pushed the book to and had her sign the duplicate and the receipt, and then sanded the names and blew the grit and stamped it with the county seal. "Recorded," he said. "You'll collect the copy in a week or ride back and read it here." They left with a slip that said the same in fewer words. On the way out, a rancher they didn't know tipped his hat to and called her Mrs. Hollis, and nothing snagged on the words. They turned home slow because cold air pressed the lungs and there was no need to hurry. At the sheriff's office, they stopped long enough for Grant to say, "Paper's set," and Logan looked at the slip and said, "That one ends most talk." And then he added, "If the man from San Marcos shows, he'll be told to stand on the road and state his business to me first," which settled the last angle they had not spelled out. By mid-afternoon, they were back at the ranch, the trough chipped free of ice, the curtains tied back to let the light in and then drawn again when the sun fell, and took the box from Grant's room and set it back on the high shelf there where it belonged. She did not open it. She did not move it again. She looked once at the small room that had been hers alone and saw that it had become a workroom with a washstand and a trunk and a peg with her shawl, while her place now included the table and the stove and the bed at the end of the hall. Grant saw the same and said, "We'll build shelves for your sewing and books after thaw," and she nodded because that kind of promise sits steady. They set 2 chairs side by side at the table without thinking about it, and ate stew with warm bread and cut a slice for Patch on a plate set by the door, and he waited until and nodded and then took it. Bishop blew once in the stall and quieted. The wind moved along the eave and did not lift the tin because the nails held. Grant checked the shotgun and set it where it always sat, breech open, cartridges high, and put the quinine in the tin and set the tin back. She wrote the parson's receipt number and the clerk's name into the household ledger and underlined both and shut the book. They looked over the pantry list and crossed off what had been bought, added milk cow in spring and seed potatoes and 2 hens with a rooster if ridges will spare. They agreed to Sundays at church if the road allowed, and to a loaf every week for the ridges until the starter had a stubborn life of its own. They spoke the next day out loud. Grant to fix the east trough brace and cut 2 wedges for the south gate, and to wash linens, turn the mattress, and mend the heel of his second pair of socks, and then fell quiet because the plan held on its own. At last light, they walked to the cottonwood and stood the way families do when something ends and something starts. Grant said, "I'll keep this place straight," and said, "I'll keep this place warm," and those 2 lines covered everything that needed covering. They walked back with the kind of tired that comes from work done and weather-born and talk set in the right places. Inside, they banked the fire and checked latches and turned the lamp down and stood near the stove again, because that was where the shape of them had been set. Grant reached for Anne's hand, and she gave it. And he said, "You belong here," and she said, "I know." And it did not sound like a new thought, only the plain truth finally written everywhere it mattered. In the church book, in the county book, in the store ledger on the door latch, on her finger, in the way the house no longer sounded empty when the wind touched it. There were no loose ends left to pull. The sheriff knew and stood where a lawman should. The neighbors had signed and shown up. The parson had put ink in the book. The county clerk had put ink in a bigger one. The wage ledger was closed without debt, and the household ledger had begun. The man from San Marcos had been answered and would find no hold on the door. The herd counted 24 with the calf on its feet. The roof held. The pump worked. The wheel turned without complaint. The dog answered a patch and slept out of the wind. The grave was tended. The box stayed shut and respected. And 2 chairs at the table sat side by side and would be pulled out each night without being asked. In the morning, they would rise and do what needed doing, and they would do it together. A widowed rancher no longer alone, and a woman who no longer asked if she could stay because the house, the land, and the paper all said she already did.
And that's it for today's video. Thank you so much for hanging out with Where Grit Meets Heart. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss out on what's next. See you soon.